Hector, Achilles, Agamemnon, Priam. The Trojan War was the most legendary conflict in all of ancient history. A tale of heroes, of pride and glory, played out like a board game by competing factions of Olympian deities. Told and retold by hearth fire and camp flame over the long generations. Until, eventually, it was immortalised in the written works of the poet Homer that come down to us today. The ancient Greeks themselves viewed the Trojan War as not only one of the most important historical events, but an integral part of who they were. A tale that helped shape their post-Bronze Age sense of identity as the Hellenes. Although the Greeks never had any doubt about the historicity of the conflict, already during ancient times there were disagreements when it came to the details and dating. Herodotus dated the war to approximately 1250 BC, while the Parian Chronicle placed it from 1217 to 1208. Eventually, the most commonly accepted date among the Hellenes was the one estimated by Eratosthenes, philosopher and chief librarian of the Great Library of Alexandria. A most serious scholar who also worked out that the world was not flat in the 3rd century BC. He precisely calculated the fall of Troy to 1184 BC. Throughout subsequent Roman and Byzantine times, and even well into the early modern period, the historicity of the event remained relatively unquestioned. By then, however, the once glorious city of Troy was a thing of the mythic past. Its walls buried beneath the surface, and even its precise location unknown to contemporary scholars. Finally, by the 19th century, as new ideas and revolutions transformed reality in that gilded age of discovery, the pool of evidence for Troy was so lacking that many scholars began to cast doubt on the idea that a Trojan War had ever really happened in the first place. After all, the Iliad, as great of a masterpiece of epic poetry as it is at its core a mythological tale, with very little historical evidence. Nobody then could point to where exactly Troy had once stood. Did such a city ever even exist, they asked. As skepticism grew, so too did the interest of those wishing to find and locate the once mighty Ilion. Many scholars of an antiquarian dissuasion roamed far and wide in the heartlands of the Ottoman Empire at this time. And throughout the century, many pointed to a particular site near the mouth of the Dardanelles, heading towards Istanbul, as a likely location for Homer's Troy. Today, it's called Hissarlik. One of those curious individuals to pick up on the thread was a German businessman and early archaeologist by the name of Heinrich Schliemann. Independently wealthy from dealings in St. Petersburg and then the California gold rush, Schliemann reportedly had grown up on the tales of Homer and was now determined to find and unearth that legendary city of days gone by. From 1870 to 1890 then, the first major excavations at Hittite would take place. Schliemann famously ending up destroying much of the world he'd sought when he attempted to dynamite his way to the relevant levels. Nonetheless, the results were fascinating. Ruins of mighty walls, treasure rooms, and a large fortified citadel that overlooked the area from a hill. Heinrich Schliemann had found the real Troy, he proclaimed. The city of legendary King Priam and of the great hero Hector. The place where the Trojans made their last stand against the grand Achaean force of King Agamemnon. Even today, after more than a century of continual archaeology, it remains remarkably difficult to completely rule out that this place was the real city of Ilion. It begs the question, could the rest of the legend be true also? Astonishingly, a growing amount of data increasingly suggests that, yes, a conflict at Troy really could have taken place. Even if amounting to little more than a skirmish by competing archaic powers, growing over the years after to become the most important story of the classical world. Using all the latest archaeological evidence, from Greece to the highlands of Anatolia and beyond, this is the story of the real Trojan War. My name's Pete Kayleigh. You're watching History Time. Don't forget to subscribe and watch these other ridiculously long programs that I made earlier, many of them directly relevant to this one. And you can also come with me to explore Anatolia in September. So have a look at all the details here. We're going to go to Göbekli Tepe, Hattusa, many sites directly relevant to this video. Hope to see you there. Now, back to the real Trojan War. It quickly became apparent that the site of Hittite did not, in fact, consist of one Troy, but many distinct settlements, stacked one on top of the other over a period of several thousand years. From modest fishing village to late Bronze Age metropolis. By the 1890s, as excavations continued under Schliemann's colleague Wilhelm Dörpfeld, 10 or more distinct layers were identified and defined, dating from the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, all the way through to the Roman period. As time passed and the excavation progressed under Carl Blegen and other successors in the early 20th century, more and more refined techniques were used to properly identify and document these layers. In contrast to Heinrich Schliemann's earlier, often crude and destructive methods. Techniques that continue to be honed and sharpened today. The archaeologists, therefore, were able to single out 2 key layers that correlate to the historical Troy of the late Bronze Age. The layer known as Troy 6 had been a major late Bronze Age city, spanning from around 1750 to to about 1300 BC. This was the largest and wealthiest of all the Bronze Age Troys. Dominated by a massive fortified citadel and a sprawling lower town that controlled trade routes near the Dardanelles Strait, from the Aegean to the Black Sea. Still an integral trade route today. The archaeology further suggests close connections to Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and mainland Mycenaean Greece. After a great flourishing of hundreds of years, Troy 6 faced a fiery, destructive event in around 1300 BC, which is likely to have been an earthquake. But the city was quickly rebuilt in a more contracted space. The next layer, Troy 7a, represents the city from 1300 to about 1180 BC. It is precisely this Troy and its archaeologically confirmed destruction in 1180 that nearly perfectly corresponds with Eratosthenes' accepted date of 1184 BC for the fall of Troy. Although initially labelled as two separate layers, modern scholarly consensus generally holds that these two represent a single archaeological site, with the sublayer of Troy 7a being a more well-fortified continuation of Troy 6. Archaeological excavations portray a picture of the golden age of the city during the late Bronze Age period. A citadel protected by massive limestone walls. Within the citadel, home to the high elite of the Trojan world, was a large palatial complex. In its centre, the Megaron, reminiscent of Mycenaean-style architecture, with walls around 5 meters thick and up to 10 meters tall. There were no less than 5 gates, protected with towers and other fortifications. It's all reminiscent of the poems of Homer. During the Troy 7a period, then, even more emphasis was put on defence. What appears to be damage to some of the fortifications, dated to the end of Troy 6 in about 1300 BC, was quickly repaired and expanded in the following decades. Among other fortifications, the monumental South Gate was strengthened, its entrance repaved, and its drainage system improved. Troy was getting defensively enhanced, a kind of siege mentality seeming to prevail. Everyone getting ready for some great conflict to come. No other ancient Greek conflict was told as grandiosely and profoundly as it was in the Iliad, the greatest epic of them all. Something of a Bible for adherents of classical Mediterranean paganism. Morality tale and campsite entertainment all rolled into one. Apparently composed by about 400 years after the demise of the city, Homer's legendary poem sings of the terrible war, of great heroes on both sides, and their inevitable fate before the gates of Ilion. Though in truth, we don't know much about its creation. its style and structure seeming to suggest multiple different oral traditions coming together to create a whole. Once finally written down by the 8th century BC, its influence would become immeasurable. On one side, with half of the Olympian gods supporting them, the Trojan defenders were led by their greatest champion, Crown Prince Hector of Troy, the eldest son of King Priam. His younger brother Paris, one of the chief reasons for the outbreak of the war, had previously been to Sparta on a diplomatic visit. He had returned with Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, and wife of the Spartan king, Menelaus. This Trojan abduction of the Spartan queen was not to go unanswered. Not only was Menelaus the ruler of Sparta, but he was also a brother of a far more powerful king, the great Agamemnon of Mycenae, the overlord of all Hellas. In the past, Helen of Sparta had been propositioned by over 30 suitors from across Greece. Regional kings, princes and nobles alike, attracted by the allure of the most beautiful woman in all the world. Ultimately, it was Agamemnon's brother Menelaus who had won her hand. But what he also won was an oath of the suitors that should any wrong come upon Menelaus and his marriage, they would come to his defence. An oath that would be utilised by Agamemnon to its fullest extent. When it came down to it, every king, every prince, every military commander being called to arms by the king of Mycenae. Unsurprisingly, the call extended even to those who were not among the suitors. Every leader across the entire Greek world was to provide a military contingent to Agamemnon's great Achaean army. Among these champions were names that echoed throughout history. No doubt famous already from other stories. Heroes such as Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, Nestor, Patroclus, Idomeneus, and dozens of others. Perhaps most famous of all, however, was Achilles, the greatest warrior of all the Greeks. His prowess was unmatched, his skill unchallenged on the field of battle. But his pursuit of glory was relentless, and his hubris often put him at odds with his own compatriots. Most prominently, with another like-minded and power-hungry individual, who'd been gradually consuming more and more territory over the preceding years. His own king, Agamemnon. Ultimately, the great Achaean coalition and its cohort of overwatching Olympians was assembled in Aulis in Boeotia. From where Agamemnon, the king of men, declared war on Troy, before sailing with over 1,000 ships towards the shores of Ilion. But did any of this really happen? Was there a real war at Wilusa, the one described in the Iliad? Or is there more to this story? A forgotten real conflict rooted not in the myth of the succeeding Iron Age, but in the chariot-riding great kings of the Age of Bronze. And does the Iliad completely miss out one of the major players in this conflict. The Greeks, for their part, really did have a significant historical presence across the Aegean in the Late Bronze Age. Seen in widespread archaeological sites across that formative sea. And most telling of all, they had ambitions in Western Asia Minor too. Undoubtedly including the site known now as Hissarlik. Thousands of their sites have been excavated over the last 150 years, revealing a complex state-building civilization, obsessed with beauty, art, and the natural world, yet imbued with a fierce warrior spirit. To modern scholars, they are known as the Mycenaeans. After their most powerful palatial centre, overlooking today's Argolid Plain. Though this was just one of many, and is not a term they would have been at all familiar with. Instead, the term Achaeans, which is most prominently used by Homer and other epic poets, was likely based on the actual name, Achaeology, which Bronze Age Greeks used themselves. Over the course of the Late Bronze Age, initially outshone by Aegean and Minoan rivals, the Achaeans managed to rise from their core regions of Argolis, Attica, Boeotia, and the wider Peloponnese to spread their power and influence across the Aegean. First taking over much of the Greek mainland between 1750 and 1500 BC. Then in the 15th century BC, as they entered a so-called palatial stage of far greater sophistication, they either militarily conquered or at least took over the wealthiest Aegean civilization the world had ever seen. The Minoans of Crete. Achaean influence did not stop there, however. By the 14th century BC, a foothold was established in western Anatolia, with a main centre of operations seeming to be the stronghold of Miletus, formerly a place of Minoan influence. The neighbouring kingdom of Arzawa, with its capital at Ephesus, seems to have become an important Mycenaean ally. A situation which allowed the Greeks to project power and pursue their interests in the region. Another significant entity was the city of Troy, at the heart of a kingdom which controlled the northwestern region of Anatolia, with a strategic position connecting the Aegean with the Black Sea. It may well be that Troy would become a long-desired prize in the eyes of the Achaeans. Surviving records hint of such a situation. Unfortunately, details on the historical Mycenaean perspective on Troy are not as well understood as they should be. The Greek writing system of the Late Bronze Age was a syllabic script, today called Linear B. It was almost certainly based on the earlier Minoan Linear A writing system, and developed in the later part of the 15th century after the Mycenaean takeover of Crete. Unfortunately, although deciphered, the Linear B archives of Knossos, Pylos, Mycenae and elsewhere do not tell us much beyond the administrative records of the palace centres. Stories, histories, these are not. For the most part, the Greeks used their writing system to account for the production and distribution of goods and materials by the palatial centres. It did not record the political situation of the time, nor the whereabouts of Mycenaean expansion, nor even relations with other kingdoms and peoples. Despite having unearthed over 5,000 Linear B tablets, we are yet to find a single name of a Mycenaean king inscribed on any of them, beyond the commonly encountered royal title of Wanax. Likewise, foreign kingdoms are rarely ever found in these records. A mention of Assi-Widja vaguely refers to the area of western Anatolia, which Troy was likely associated with, at least to a degree. However, not a single preserved inscription mentions Troy or Ilion by name. When it comes to the historical Trojans then, at least when the Mycenaean point of view is concerned, we're in the dark. However, there is another great empire and capital city we can turn to flesh out the tale. The Mycenaean Greeks were not the only power seeking to expand and further their influence in western Anatolia. To the east, the mighty Hittite Empire of the Anatolian highlands stood firm as by far the greatest power in these parts. The Hatti, as they called themselves, were one of the great powers of the known world. Rivals of Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria for supremacy in the Near East. Emissaries of all, and lesser states too, having regularly travelled to the great walled metropolis of Hattusa to do business and pay homage to the king. And thankfully for us, the Hittites left historical records behind. Not just fragmentary accounts, but a vast archive of cuneiform tablets recording huge amounts of information about their world. By the 17th century BC, after many centuries of struggle, the Hittite state emerged around the city of Hattusa and the surrounding region. Always a warlike people, already during the time of the Old Kingdom, the Hatti had expanded in all directions, cementing their place as one of the most powerful kingdoms of the age. Even the great city of Babylon was once sacked by the Hittite army during the reign of King Mursili I. To their west, the Hittites also looked to further their power and influence. Among their most prominent adversaries there was the kingdom of Arzawa. Together with a wider spectrum of states and polities, which they called Assuwa. Assuwa was the Hittite version of Assi-Widja, found in the Mycenaean Linear B records, as well as the origin of the word Asia, which originally corresponded to the Western Anatolian kingdoms. One of these kingdoms was known to the Hatti as Wilusa. This was a prominent kingdom in northwestern Anatolia, consisting of a great fortified city and the surrounding area it controlled. This was the Hittite name for the historical kingdom of Ilios, or Troy. The first mention of Wilusa in the Hittite records comes from the time of King Tudalia I in the late 15th century BC. One of the first great conquerors of the Hittite New Kingdom. As he expanded westwards, one of Tudalia's chief adversaries was the Asua Confederation. It was an alliance consisting of no less than 22 states and kingdoms of Western Asia Minor. Among them was the Kingdom of Wilusa, mentioned alongside Taruisa, likely corresponding to the Troad, the surrounding region controlled by the Trojans. Tudalia was able to defeat and subsequently dissolve the Asua alliance, although he reportedly did not march against Wilusa itself. This victory allowed the Hittites to establish their own foothold in western Anatolia, and finally come head to head with the great Achaean warriors of Mycenaean Greece. The Bronze Age Greek polity was known in the Hittite records as Achaea, or later Achaeawa, and was for a time at least considered to be a great power on its own, a rival of the Hatti in an everlasting battle for influence in the region. Wilusa was thus stuck between the two competing powers, and had to navigate its own position throughout much of the late Bronze Age. According to the Hittite texts, Wilusa was largely at peace with the Hatti, and regularly exchanged messengers throughout this period. Such reportedly remained the case in the 14th century, when the Hittite king Suppiluliuma defeated the Arzawan expansion eastwards, and revived the power of the Hatti after decades of decline. It is to this period that we track the earliest recorded name of a Wilusan king. King Kukuni, as he was known to the Hittites, was a contemporary of Suppiluliuma in the second half of the 15th century. During his reign, Wilusa maintained good relations with the Hittite ruler, and regularly sent messengers to the Hatti. Although he was the first king of historical Troy to be known by name, King Kukuni was also the last Trojan monarch associated with the time of peace. The subsequent period in Wilusa brought turbulence, instability, and war. A flash of sunlight on bronze. Huge gates of the city above. The clamouring din of spear on shield. Perhaps they came from the new Achaean colonies on the islands of Lesbos or Limnos, these war bands arranged around chariot-borne leaders. Perhaps much further afield, their countrymen having roamed the seas for centuries. The atmosphere is tense. A battle will be fought. When archaeologists remove the mist of the heroic tales, lifting the clouds of Greek mythology, a nonetheless fascinating time of instability in the last centuries of the Bronze Age is revealed. A clash for political and military supremacy in the region of the Troad. A real conflict involving Troy. As far as we're aware, happening without the interference of Zeus, Athena, and Apollo on the mortal plane. Fought out on the fields and shores around the city of Wilusa, with chariots and weapons of bronze. Recorded by contemporary scribes of the all-powerful Hittite Empire. And yet, even with all the available historical sources, we are far from completely solving the puzzle. What we know is that between the late 14th and early 12th century BC, the historical city of Wilusa, usually seen as one and the same as Hittite and Troy, was either a part of or directly engaged in several military conflicts. Whether any of these bouts of violence was the one described by Homer, we can only wonder. But the overall situation does seem at least somewhat similar. The Hittite texts painting a picture of Wilusa as being in the middle of a perennial struggle for supremacy in the region, between the maritime power of Achaeans on one side and the Hittite Empire the other. For any researcher attempting to determine the historicity and potentially real nature of the Trojan War, multiple recorded struggles involving Wilusa have to be considered. The overarching background of the cuneiform tablets, not involving Prince Paris abducting Helen of Sparta, but geopolitical conflict between the Greeks and the Hittites. In the 14th century BC, the status quo of Western Anatolia had been broken when the Hittite king Mursili II made war against the kingdom of Arzawa. Viewing this new Hittite king as weak, not worthy of his great father Suppiluliuma, the Arzawans themselves prepared for war, backed by their fierce Mycenaean Greek allies. Mursili II, however, would not only prove the Arzawans wrong, but would launch a devastating campaign aimed at a decisive outcome. By the time he was finished, the kingdom of Arzawa was no more. By the end of the century, the Hittites being able to completely dissolve the Arzawan state, splitting its territory between three Hittite client kingdoms: Hapala, Mira, and the Siha Riverlands. Beyond these three polities stood only Wilusa in the northwest and the Mycenaean strongholds on the western coast. The Greeks had just lost their chief ally to the Hatti, who were now expanding their own sphere of vassal states. It was now only a matter of time before the Hittites turned towards Wilusa. This was not something that the men of Achaea would accept so easily, however. Arzawa may have been no more, but the conflict had just begun. The Achaean strategy now shifted to instigating anti-Hittite rebellions in the region, spanning everywhere from the conquered Arzawa lands to the city of Wilusa itself. It didn't take long for the Greeks to find a willing ally for their schemes. By the beginning of the 13th century BC, a warlord known as Pia Maradu emerging as the chief Hittite enemy in western Anatolia. his authority among the Arzawan rebels, perhaps suggesting a connection with the deposed Arzawan ruling family. Though, of course, this is difficult to determine with any certainty. For the Hittites, he was simply a new enemy to defeat. Pia-Maredu was heavily backed by the Mycenaeans of the coast, and soon his rebellion set the whole region ablaze once again. He captured a part of former Arzawa that bordered Mycenaean Miletus, and established it as his base of operations. The conflict would span decades to come. And soon enough, war arrived at Wilusa. As for the historical Trojans, we simply don't know their position towards either side leading up to this point. The Hittite sources generally depicting positive relations between Hatti and Wilusa in the previous generation, during the reign of King Kukuni. The Mycenaeans, on the other hand, don't offer us their own perspective due to the lack of any external policy matters in the Linear B texts. What we do know is that at some point during the early part of the century, the Mycenaeans went to Wilusa, bringing war in their wake. Whether Pia-Maredu took part in this expedition is unknown. For his part, he was strongly allied with the Mycenaean governor in Miletus, a man named Atpa, or Atpas. Pia-Maredu reportedly invaded the Sihar Riverland and subjugated its king, Manapa-Tarhantu, forcing him to become a vassal of Atpa. The island of Lesbos was also subjugated, together with a group of craftsmen who'd reportedly defected from the Hittites. It is at this point that the Hittites finally responded. With matters to attend to all over his vast empire, the new king, Muwatalli II, was able to dispatch an imperial army to Wilusa, headed by a general named Kassu. It is noteworthy that Manapa-Tarhantu, king of the Sihar Riverland, while officially still pledging allegiance to the Hittites, found a reason not to aid them in their Wilusa expedition. This is known from the so-called Manapa-Tarhantu letter, which this ruler of Sihar sent to the Hittite king during his expedition to Wilusa.
Thus says Manapa-Tarhunta, your servant. Say to his majesty, my lord, at the moment everything is fine in the land. Kassu came here and brought the troops of Hatti, and when they went back to attack Wilusa, I was ill. My illness is terrible, the sickness has beaten me down severely. When Pia-Maredu humiliated me, he installed Atpa over me. Then he attacked Lesbos, and obviously all the dyers who belonged to me went over to him. Those who belonged to your majesty, and all without exception, went over.
Ultimately, the conflict was resolved when Atpa of Miletus agreed to return the craftsmen to the Hittites. Likewise, the Sihar Riverland was also placed back under Hittite vassalage. What happened to Wilusa is unclear, both leading up to and over the course of this conflict. What we do know is that shortly afterwards, King Muwatalli established a treaty with the Trojans, known as the Alexandru Treaty, after the curiously named King Alexandru, the second historically recorded ruler of Wilusa. The terms of the treaty placed Wilusa under a form of vassalage under the Hittites. Wilusa was to provide troops to the Hatti in the case of war, and the Hittite king was to protect Alexandru's claim to the throne against both external and internal threats. The Hittite king apparently even downplays the line of succession.
When your death day arrives, Alexander, then, in regard to the son of yours, whom you designate for kingship, whether he is by your wife or your concubine, and even if he is still a child, if the population of the land refuses him and says as follows, he is the progeny, my majesty will not agree.
This suggests that perhaps Alexander was either not originally a part of the royal succession at Troy, or that he had possibly been overthrown. What is also interesting is that his name, Alexander, is a Hittite rendering of an apparently Greek name, Alexander. Oddly enough, in a seemingly garbled and half-remembered throwback to real events, Alexander is an alternative name of the Trojan prince Paris from Homer's story. From this point on, it appears that Troy was no longer an independent kingdom, but a vassal of the Hittite Empire. So what role did Mycenaean Greeks play in these events? Was their war over Wilusa a part of a larger anti-Hittite campaign, coordinated between Atpa of Miletus and Pia-Maredu? Did the Achaean-Hittite conflict over Troy break out as a result of the Muwatalli-Alexandru Treaty? Or something else entirely lost to history? Although we appear to have more questions than answers regarding the timeline, one thing is certain. The Mycenaean-Hittite hostilities really did escalate into an open conflict at Wilusa. And elsewhere, the Mycenaeans did continue to provide support to Pia-Maredu. When first found in the early 1900s, the Hittite tablets of Hattusa caused a great stir in the world of archaeology. Here, amidst tens of thousands of records, we may have a historically recorded military conflict over Troy, where the famed Achaean army landed on the shores of Wilusa and attempted to wrestle the city out of imperial Hittite hands. Through negotiations between the two great kings, the conflict eventually ended, and peace was declared. We know of this from a correspondence sent in around 1250 BC by the ruler of Hatti to his Achaean counterpart. The so-called Tawagalawa letter, where he complains about the continued campaigns of Pia-Maredu, despite the already established Achaean-Hittite peace. The Hittite king pleads with the ruler of Ahiyawa to not allow Pia-Maredu to use Achaean territory as a shield while attacking and raiding the Hittites and their clients. In one of the most intriguing segments of all, he also makes a reference to a previous war over Wilusa, which had apparently already been settled between the two great kings.
Oh, my brother, write to him this one thing, if nothing else. Get up and go off to Hatti. Your lord has reconciled with you. If not, then come over to Ahiyawa, and in whatever location I settle you, go up and resettle in another location. So long as you are hostile to the king of Hatti, be hostile from another land. Do not be hostile from my land. If you would rather be in Karkia or Massa, go there. The king of Hatti has persuaded me about the matter of the land of Wilusa, concerning which he and I were hostile to one another, and we have made peace. Now hostility is not appropriate between us. Send that to him. And to me, my brother, in the matter, send it to me. And concerning the matter of Wilusa, about which we were hostile, because we have made peace, what then? If a certain ally confesses an offence before his ally, because he confesses the offence before his ally, he does not reject him. Because I have confessed my offence before my brother, let it no further to my brother.
What exactly caused this conflict, and how it was settled, remains unknown. However, the conciliatory tone used by the Hittite king, believed to be Hattusa III, does suggest some kind of agreement with which the Hittites were pleased. He mentions an offence against his Achaean counterpart that he confessed to, which has presumably since been settled. Was this the real conflict over Troy that lies behind the myths of Homer's Iliad? The time period of these events certainly does correspond to at least some of the Trojan War dating provided by later ancient Greek writers. In particular, Herodotus's estimate of 1250 BC matches this real struggle over Wilusa, which took place during the mid-13th century. However, many of the other details of the Homeric epics clearly do not match the political environment during these years. Firstly, the city of Wilusa clearly continued to exist throughout the later part of the century. We know this not only through the Achaean Hittite settlement, but by subsequent historical rulers of the city, one of whom was a pro-Hittite king of Troy named Walmu. The city of Miletus also remained an Achaean stronghold at the time, governed by Atpus and serving as a safe harbour for Piamaradu. In the Iliad, the city is not controlled by the Achaeans at all. It was the seat of the Carians, who fought on the side of Troy. Perhaps most important of all, the Hittites themselves were never even mentioned in Homer's works, nor in any other ancient Greek source at all, memory of them apparently having been wiped out entirely. Perhaps the Homeric Trojan War refers to another event that took place sometime later, and without Hittite involvement. Perhaps this mid-13th century conflict has another, possibly better equivalent in Greek mythology, also mentioned by Homer. Because Greek legend has it that a couple of generations before the Trojan War, another smaller Achaean expedition laid waste on Ilion, even sacking the city itself. This campaign was led by the legendary Heracles. In a time when Troy was ruled by Priam's father, King Laomedon, Heracles was involved in the rescue of the king's daughter, Hesione, from a sea monster. The promised reward, however, was not honoured by Laomedon, which led Heracles to return to Troy with his band of warriors. The renowned hero managed to sack the city, kill the king, and all of his sons except one, the lone survivor being Priam, who would go on to become the next ruler of Troy, slowly setting the stage for the more well-known Trojan War a generation later. By the time of the next Hittite ruler, Tudaliah IV, who ascended to the throne sometime between 1245 and 1239 BC, the balance of power had changed yet again. It appears that the king of Ahiawa was no longer in control of the stronghold of Miletus, or Milawata as it was known to the Hatti. If there is another time that perhaps better resembles the events of the Iliad, this is it. Early in his reign, Tudalia authored the so-called Milawata letter, a diplomatic correspondence sent to a Hittite vassal in western Anatolia. Presumably, King Tarkas-Nawa of Mira. Within the text, the Hittite king discussed another vassal ruler, King Walmu, being deposed in Wilusa by an anti-Hittite individual, referred to as the Evil One. Walmu apparently sought refuge at Tarkas-Nawa of Mira's court. The Hittite king, aware of this, requests that Walmu is sent on to the Hatti, so that he can be restored in Wilusa by the Hittite army.
I, my majesty, have taken up you, my son, an ordinary man, and you have recognized me as overlord. I gave the land of your father to you. But your father had always desired my border territories, and furthermore the troops. Then by night he went down. Then they took for themselves another lord, but I did not recognize the evil one. Kulanaziti retained possession of the wooden tablets that I made for Walmu, and he has now brought them down to you, my son. Examine them. Now, my son, as long as you look after the well-being of my majesty, I, my majesty, will put my trust in your goodwill. Turn Walmu over to me, my son, so that I may reinstall him in kingship in the land of Wilusa. He shall now be king of the land of Wilusa as he was formerly. He shall now be our military vassal as he was formerly. As I, my majesty, and you, my son, have established the borders of the land of Milawata, you shall not withhold your goodwill. I, my majesty, will put my trust wholeheartedly in your goodwill.
Tudalia's reference to Milawata, or Miletus, noticeably does not contain any mention of Ahiawa, which had previously held the city for centuries. Discussion on the establishment of the borders of Milawata further indicates that the Achaeans no longer held major influence on the Anatolian mainland. A situation that is apparently confirmed in another text, also dating to Tudalia's reign, which contains the final recorded Hittite reference to Ahiawa. In the so-called treaty with Shaushgamua, Tudalia addresses his vassal ruler in the land of Amaru.
Thus, says the Tabana, Tudalia, great king, king of Hatti, hero, beloved of the sun goddess of Arina, I, my majesty, great king, have taken you, Shaushgamua, by the hand and have made you brother-in-law. I have given you my sister in marriage and have made you king in the land of Amuru. Be loyal to my majesty in regard to authority. And the kings who are my equal in rank are the king of Egypt, the king of Babylonia, the king of Assyria, and the king of Ahiawa. Since the king of Assyria is the enemy of my majesty, he shall likewise be your enemy. Your merchant shall not go to Assyria, and you shall not allow his merchant into your land. He shall not pass through your land. You shall not allow any ship of Ahiawa to go to him.
Part of the inscription, counting this king of Ahiawa among the Hittite king's equals, was deleted from the text by the royal scribes. The word Ahiawa actually having been scratched out from the list, but still just about visible underneath the horizontal line that intended to remove it. For whatever reason then, by the end of the 13th century BC, Tudalia IV did not consider the Achaeans as a great power anymore. At least in the later part of his reign, Ahiawa appears to still be hostile to the Hittites, as noted by Tudalia's orders to block Achaean ships from reaching Assyrian territory. When it comes to Walmu of Wilusa, the ultimate fate of this Trojan king is not known, nor much of anything about events in that city at the time. Although the Hittite king appears to consider his vassal in Mira to be some kind of a regional overlord of underlings, there are several accusations of transgressions against the vassal king. Hittite problems in the east likely damaged their ability to intervene in the west, thus forcing them to rely on a regional king of questionable loyalty. It appears that in addition to the Achaean loss of territory, Hittite power too was on the decline in western Anatolia. Troy still stood throughout the later part of the century, but now it may have been independent once more. But with independence came opportunity for its enemies. As we approach the very end of the 13th century BC, the geopolitical situation in western Anatolia and the Aegean becomes increasingly difficult to determine. The Hittite sources no longer mention either Wilusa or Ahiawa. Hattusa seems almost entirely preoccupied with its problems to the east, including war with Assyria, but also a severe famine in the Anatolian highlands. The decline of the Hittite Empire would only continue across all fronts. In the Aegean, Mycenaean Greece nevertheless continued for a while as the chief power of the region. Linear B records from Knossos, Mycenae, Pylos, and elsewhere showing that production, trade, and labour continued all across the major palatial centres. However, a time of uncertainty was approaching. Visible all across the Mycenaean world in colossal fortifications and other defences, dwarfing those of previous ages. The citadel of Mycenae, for example, had its cyclopean masonry extended to include a secret tunnel leading to a secured natural water supply in case of a siege. The gate was also strengthened with a bastion, as well as a smaller northern entrance, which was heavily reinforced. At Tiryns, the massive cyclopean walls were extended to include the entire lower citadel. The entrance gate was redesigned to include a series of narrow passages between the walls. Making it more difficult for an enemy to successfully enter the city. Like Mycenae, Tiryns saw construction of tunnels in the northern wall of the lower citadel that led to water sources. Similarly, other centres, such as Athens and Thebes, increased their defences and citadel fortifications. The Isthmus of Corinth even saw the construction of a massive cyclopean wall, designed to protect the entire peninsula against any incursions from the north. The Achaeans were getting ready for war. Across the Aegean, the situation was not so different at Troy. Throughout the 13th century BC, Troy 7a had seen increased fortification all across the citadel. Inside the city, the houses were more densely packed, focusing more on protection within the city walls rather than the grandeur of the previous age. The walls of Ilion were reinforced with additional stone towers. The southern section was improved with a new extension, making approach more difficult for any potential attackers. The south gate, the main entrance to the city, had its central passage repaved, with drainage installed beneath it. It was flanked by a massive rectangular tower, integrated directly into the wall. Towards the end of the century, all construction in and around Troy pointed to a city conducting all the necessary preparations to prepare itself for a lengthy siege. Unfortunately for us, this is where the contemporary historical records concerning Troy go dark. The declining Hittites shifted their focus away from Wilusa, at least according to the surviving evidence. Their conflicts are not of an expansionist nature anymore, but focused on defence. Troy is never mentioned again. The Mycenaean Linear B tablets don't reveal anything about Ilion either. All that we have is archaeology. Archaeology which suggests the Achaeans were preparing themselves for a military conflict. And so too Troy. It is during this historical void, this absence of the written historical records, that a real Trojan War may well have taken place. Perhaps the one which lasted for 10 years and which left the city a wreck. Was there a real Achilles, a real Hector, a real Agamemnon? Was there a fleet of 1,000 Achaean ships which sailed across the Aegean towards the city of Priam? We simply don't know. The real siege of Troy was not recorded in any contemporary writings. And even if it was, those texts were not preserved, not available to us today. However, the records of the war are still there, embedded in the walls of the city itself, in the houses, or what remains of them, in the traces of fire that raged throughout the city, revealing a clear outcome. The city of Troy was sacked, burned, pillaged, destroyed to such an extent it was finished as a relevant power in northwestern Anatolia, never to regain its former glory. However, it was not only Troy that suffered destruction at this time. Almost simultaneously, at the end of the century, the Mycenaean cities themselves were sacked and burned. The palatial centre of Pylos was completely destroyed and left in ruins. Preserved Linear B tablets record hasty preparations against an attack from the sea. One which ultimately brought the city down. Other sites such as Mycenae, Thebes and Tiryns all suffered heavy damage. Only peripheral powers like Athens and a few others withstood the collapse, lingering on as shadows of the time before. This wave of destruction began a century of heavy Mycenaean decline, by the end of which the Greek world had plunged into a new dark age. Whether this collapse is connected to a conflict with Troy, or perhaps another event, we can't be sure. In Greek mythology and tradition, there were several such conflicts. First, upon the destruction of Troy, the victorious Mycenaean king Agamemnon returned to Argolis. However, he would soon be assassinated in a plot organised by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegistheus. What followed was a terrible civil war. Eventually, it would be the son of Agamemnon, Orestes, who emerged victorious. But not even the conclusion of this conflict secured long-term peace among the Achaeans. During the reign of his son, Tisamennius, the stories outline a new threat upon the Peloponnese, coming down from the north. The Dorians. The Dorian tribes had long inhabited the areas around Epirus, Thessaly, and the mountainous regions of central Greece, we're told. It's said that under the leadership of the descendants of Heracles, the Dorians came down to the former power base of Mycenae, defeated King Tisamenus, and finally put an end to the decaying Mycenaean kingdom. Whether this traditional Mycenaean collapse story can be historically attributed to the emergence of Peloponnesian Dorians, to a conflict involving Troy, or perhaps another catastrophe, remains a matter of scholarly debate. The Hittite Empire, however, was not given a chance to recover. It was destroyed in around 1180 BC, along with its capital city Hattusa, and never rose again. The Hittite fall, however, was much better documented than that of the Achaeans. During the reign of the final king of Hatti, Suppiluliuma II, a terrible attack was recorded, waged against the Hittites and their allies on both land and sea. Initially, Suppiluliuma claimed victory over a Western Anatolian coalition, including Wianawanda, Tamina, Massa, Lucca, and Icuna. But only a decade or so later, Hittite fortunes seem to have completely reversed. Hattusa, alongside her vassal states in Ugarit and Alashia, found themselves fighting for their very existence against another invasion coming from the west. A situation famously seen in a letter composed by the ruler of Ugarit, Amurapi. and sent to a Hittite governor in Carchemish.
My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it, the 7 ships of the enemy have inflicted much damage upon us.
Very shortly afterwards, the Hittites' own capital was sacked and burned. The kingdom of Achaea on Cyprus shared the same fate. Unfortunately, the constituents of this invading coalition were not recorded in the preserved Hittite records. Though a reference to Lucca does highlight one of the major Hittite enemies, the Lycians, existing to the south of the former Mycenaean lands of western Anatolia, but not much beyond that. Modern scholars consider this campaign, as well as the Mycenaean collapse, to be a part of the broader collapse of the Late Bronze Age that took place during the first half of the 12th century BC. The final fall of Troy 7a, taking place around 1180 BC. Just like Hattusa, though most of the historical details are lost, would have been part of this same chain of events, spreading across the entire known world. The relations between the individual events, especially when it comes to the Mycenaeans and Troy, and their further impact on the Hittite collapse, remain an enigma. As far as we're aware, no Hittites, nor Mycenaeans, nor Trojans left records on who destroyed their civilization. Not that survived anyway. However, further to the south, another great civilization not only observed some of these events, but very much recorded them for posterity. The new kingdom of Egypt was the wealthiest and arguably the most powerful of all late Bronze Age kingdoms. From their power base in the Nile Valley, Egyptian pharaohs observed the annihilation of their brother kings in the Hittite Empire. Knowing that Egypt too was a target, they set about their preparations. Already during the reign of the pharaoh Meneptah in 1208 BC, Egypt was attacked by a sea-borne coalition that came to aid the mortal enemies of the pharaoh, the Libyans. The Egyptians recorded their enemies, listing Lucca, Shekelesh, Teresh, and Ekwesh as the Libyan allies that came from the sea. The so-called people of the sea, or sea peoples, named by modern scholars. One of these people, the Lucca, was the same enemy listed as Ugarit as having been involved in their destruction. The Ekwesh are important here too, as many scholars today regard this term as one and the same with Achaeans and Achaeans. If so, this means that at least some factions of Mycenaean Greeks were a part of the population movements that brought the Bronze Age to its end. Unfortunately, the Egyptians did not mention the destruction of Troy either, being too far removed geographically from the Aegean. However, They do seem to make a reference to destruction across western Anatolia only a few decades later, during the reign of the pharaoh Ramesses III. It is precisely these waves of attacks during Ramesses' time that brought down the Hittites, and subsequently targeted Egypt. In the Medinet Habu inscription of Thebes, Ramesses records the following.
The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kayleigh, Carchemish and Alashia being cut off at one time. A camp was set upon in the land of Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which had never come into being. They were coming towards Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denyen and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the land as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting, our plans will succeed.
Ultimately, the Egyptian army was able to defeat the Sea Peoples on both land and sea between around 1180 and 1175 BC. Although in this particular campaign there is no reference to the Ekwesh, many have argued that this time the Greeks were recorded under the term Denyen, which the Egyptians listed as one of the groups that were part of the attack. Whether Denyen could be a reference to Danans, a term that Homer uses synonymously with Achaeans to generally describe the Greeks, is uncertain, but possible. Egyptian references to Arzawa are key here too, named as one of the lands destroyed by the Sea Peoples. Possibly a vague Egyptian interpretation of the conflict in western Anatolia that resulted in the fall of Troy. In the Hittite sources, the historical Troy or Wilusa was sometimes generally grouped among the broader Arzawa lands, together with Mira, Siha and Hapala. Although the land of Arzawa had long ceased to exist as an independent political entity by 1200 BC, having been destroyed by the Hittites over a century earlier, we may be seeing either its re-emergence as a result of the new geopolitical situation, or it being mistaken for the re-emergence of smaller realms like Wilusa. We also know that immediately after the destruction of Hattusa, Ugarit and Alashia, a number of Greek polities emerge on Cyprus. Together with the local production of sub-Mycenaean pottery. This definitely implies that at least some Mycenaean colonists were a part of the Sea People coalition that Ramesses III mentioned at Medinet Habu. These same Mycenaeans that presumably destroyed Alashia on Cyprus could have been present during the destruction of Arzawa, perhaps even involved in the destruction of Troy itself. After all, in the Odyssey, following the fall of Troy, King Menelaus of Sparta spends a considerable amount of time in Egypt, making his fortune. Unfortunately, the limited and garbled sources can only tell us so much. Whether the Greeks archaeologically recorded on Cyprus were part of a major war that was waged on Troy by the Achaeans, and then subsequently ended up colonizing lands further afield, just as it is said in the tales of ancient Greek tradition, we can't say for sure. Likewise, whether the so-called Trojan War was a part of the wider sequence of campaigns and movements of peoples of the age. Movements which saw the Mycenaean palace centres themselves destroyed, and perhaps prompted bands of Achaean warriors to seek new lands across the sea. We can't say either. But both remain possibilities. The Late Bronze Age. The highest apogee humanity had yet achieved, thus ended in blood and fire. The city of Troy, as well as those of the Achaeans, fell with it. The archaeological layer of Troy 7b indicates that the site continued to be inhabited for another 200 years, although in a much reduced capacity, with barely any significance remaining. Ultimately, by 900 BC, with the arrival of Aeolian Greek colonists, it too was converted into a Greek trading post and sanctuary. What was left were stories of a great war. Legends of Agamemnon, who stopped at nothing until Troy was burned to the ground. Of Achilles, the greatest of all warriors, invincible on the field of battle. Of Hector, who gave his life to protect his city. Of the cunning Odysseus, and of the trickery of the great wooden horse that had to be used to defeat impregnable Troy. And the great journey to return home. Legends that continue to be told and retold today, and will likely continue to do so long after our own civilization comes to an end. Hello folks, I hope you enjoyed the episode. The Bronze Age is just such a ridiculously fascinating time. I can't get enough of it. That's probably why I made a 6.5 hour programme on the Mycenaeans, and one on the Hittites that's some stupid length too. Well, here's another episode on the real events that inspired the Odyssey. Not gonna lie, lining it up with the new Nolan movie. But also, why not come with me to explore some of the actual archaeological sites that inspired these myths? In September, I'm co-leading a tour to Turkey, Anatolia, where we're actually going to go to Hattusa, the incredible Hittite capital city, and so many other incredible sites like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Haran, Sogmatar, all these amazing places. You should definitely come with. All the details are down below. I hope to see you there. Thanks everyone. I'll see you on the next one.